Holland, 1636. A merchant walks into a tavern, orders a beer, and casually trades his entire house for a bag of tulip bulbs. Not seeds. Not land. Not gold. Bulbs. The kind you plant in dirt and hope for the best. And the wildest part? He thought he got a good deal. This is the story of how an entire civilization lost its mind over a flower. And why it keeps happening, over and over again, just with different names. Let's rewind to where this madness actually started. Not in a stock exchange. Not in a bank. In a garden. Carolus Clusius, a Dutch botanist, receives a shipment of exotic flower bulbs from the Ottoman Empire. He plants them in Leiden. They bloom in spring. And the Dutch people see something they have never seen before in their lives. Color. Not the dull browns and grays of a northern European winter. Not the pale yellows of wheat fields. But deep, violent, explosive color. Crimson. Purple. Scarlet. Striped. Feathered. Flowers that look like they were painted by a madman with a god complex. The Dutch went insane for them. And you have to understand something about Holland in the 1590s to understand why. This was a nation on the rise. The Dutch had just broken free from Spanish rule. Their merchant ships were beginning to dominate global trade. Money was flowing in from every corner of the known world. Spices from Indonesia. Silk from China. Silver from the Americas. The Dutch were getting rich. Fast. And rich people always need something to spend their money on. Something that says, I have arrived. Something that screams status without saying a word. Enter the tulip. Owning tulips in Holland became the equivalent of owning a Rolls-Royce today. You didn't buy them because they were useful. You bought them because they were beautiful. Because they were rare. Because your neighbor didn't have them. And in a society obsessed with merchant status and social climbing, that was everything. But here's where it gets interesting. Tulips weren't just pretty. They were unpredictable. And that unpredictability turned them into something far more dangerous than a status symbol. It turned them into a gamble. See, tulip bulbs had a strange biological quirk. A virus called the mosaic virus would occasionally infect a tulip and cause its petals to explode into wild, dramatic patterns. Flames of color shooting through the petals. Intricate feathered edges. Streaks of purple bleeding into white. No two infected tulips looked the same. No one could predict which bulb would produce a spectacular bloom and which would produce something ordinary. You plant a bulb. You wait 8 months. You either get a masterpiece or a disappointment. Sound familiar? It should. Because what the Dutch had accidentally created was a lottery. A beautiful, fragrant, completely unpredictable lottery. And humans, it turns out, are biologically incapable of walking away from a lottery. The rarest varieties got names. Semper Augustus. Admiral van Eyck. Viceroy. These weren't just flowers anymore. They were brands. They were legends. Owning a Semper Augustus bulb was like owning an original Picasso. Except Picasso wasn't born yet, so they had no idea what that meant. But you get the point. By the early 1620s, wealthy Dutch merchants were paying serious money for single bulbs of the rarest varieties. 10 guilders. 20 guilders. 50. At the time, a skilled craftsman in Holland earned around 150 guilders a year. So paying 50 guilders for a single flower bulb was insane. Completely irrational. And yet entirely normal in the circles of Dutch high society. But this was still just rich people being ridiculous with their money. What happened next turned a hobby into a national disaster. The market opened up. Before the 1630s, tulip trading was a gentleman's game. Wealthy collectors negotiating directly with growers. Quiet. Private. Exclusive. But as prices climbed and stories spread of fortunes made on a single bulb, something changed. Regular people wanted in. Weavers. Carpenters. Bakers. Chimney sweeps. People who had never owned a luxury item in their lives suddenly saw tulip trading as their ticket out. And the system accommodated them in the worst possible way. Futures contracts. See, tulip bulbs could only be dug up and transferred during summer months. But people wanted to trade year-round. So they invented a system where you could buy a promise. Not the bulb itself, but a contract guaranteeing delivery of the bulb when summer came. You pay now. You receive the bulb months later. This sounds reasonable. It was not reasonable. Because what it meant was that people were now buying and selling flowers that didn't exist yet. Theoretical flowers. Paper flowers. And those paper flowers could be resold. And resold again. And again. Without anyone ever actually seeing the bulb. The same bulb could change hands 10 times before it was ever dug out of the ground. By 1636, trading had moved out of the formal exchanges and into the taverns. Every inn in every Dutch city had become an impromptu trading floor. Men crowded around tables, scribbling contracts on scraps of paper, buying and selling bulbs they'd never seen for prices that made no rational sense. A Viceroy bulb sold for 2,500 guilders. That was enough to buy a modest house in Amsterdam. 2 lasts of wheat. 4 lasts of rye. 4 fat oxen. 8 fat swine. 12 fat sheep. 2 hogsheads of wine. 4 tons of beer. 2 tons of butter. 1,000 pounds of cheese. A complete bed. A suit of clothes. And a silver drinking cup. All of that. For 1 bulb. 1 flower. And nobody thought this was strange. Because everyone around them was doing the same thing. And everyone around them was getting rich. At least on paper. This is the moment worth pausing on. Because what happened in Holland in 1636 wasn't stupidity. It was something far more human than that. It was a consensus hallucination. Full stop. The tulip bulb wasn't worth 2,500 guilders because of any logical calculation. It was worth 2,500 guilders because enough people agreed it was. And as long as that agreement held, the price could keep climbing forever. The baker didn't buy tulips because he understood horticulture. He bought them because his neighbor bought them last month and doubled his money. And his neighbor bought them because the merchant down the street tripled his. The logic wasn't about flowers at all. It was about not missing out. Sound familiar? It should. Every asset bubble in human history runs on the same fuel. Not greed exactly. Not stupidity exactly. But a very specific kind of social madness where the price of something becomes completely detached from its actual value and nobody cares because the price keeps going up. The Dutch weren't fools. They were human. And being human means being catastrophically vulnerable to the idea that this time is different. It never is. February 3, 1637. A routine tulip auction in Haarlem. The seller puts up a lot of bulbs at a price that would have sold instantly 3 months earlier. Nobody bids. The room waits. The seller drops the price. Still nothing. Drops it again. Silence. Word spread from that tavern like fire through dry grass. In hours, across multiple cities, the same thing was happening. Sellers couldn't find buyers. Prices that had seemed unshakable yesterday were suddenly theoretical. The contracts that had been trading hands for months were now worthless paper. The bubble didn't deflate. It evaporated. Within days, tulip prices had collapsed by over 99%. Bulbs that had sold for the price of a house were now worth less than an onion. Contracts that represented life savings were toilet paper. Men who had mortgaged their homes, sold their businesses, liquidated their life savings to buy into the mania were left holding nothing but dirt and paper promises. The carpenter who sold his tools to buy bulbs had no tools and no bulbs. The weaver who pawned his loom had no loom and no flowers. The merchant who sold his warehouse had no warehouse and no future. And the cruelest part? The tulips themselves kept blooming. Every spring, right on schedule, gorgeous and indifferent to the chaos they had caused. The flowers didn't know they had destroyed people. They just grew. The aftermath was brutal. Not just financially but socially. The Dutch legal system was overwhelmed with contract disputes. Buyers who had agreed to purchase bulbs at peak prices refused to honor their contracts. Sellers who had promised delivery at certain prices couldn't afford to. Courts initially tried to enforce the contracts, then gave up and declared the whole thing a gambling debt. Which meant nobody had to pay anybody anything. Which meant everybody lost. The Dutch government tried to intervene. Committees were formed. Regulations were proposed. Officials debated for months about how to unwind the mess. In the end, most contracts were settled for a fraction of their original value. Some for nothing at all. The wealthy absorbed their losses and moved on. They had other assets. Other businesses. Other income streams. The tulip mania had been an expensive hobby that got out of hand. But for the ordinary people who had bet everything, there was no moving on. There was just the wreckage. Empty houses. Broken families. Lifetimes of work gone in a single February morning. The Dutch Golden Age continued. The merchant ships kept sailing. The empire kept expanding. But something had changed in the national psyche. A lesson had been learned in the most expensive classroom imaginable. Or had it? Here's the thing about tulip mania that most people miss. The story didn't end in 1637. It just changed costumes and started over. The South Sea Bubble. English investors pour their life savings into a company that promises impossible returns from trade with South America. The company has almost no actual trade. The stock collapses. Fortunes evaporate. Isaac Newton himself loses the equivalent of $3 million and reportedly says he could calculate the motions of heavenly bodies but not the madness of people. American stock market. Ordinary people borrowing money to buy stocks in companies they don't understand because prices only go up. Until they don't. .com bubble. Companies with no revenue, no product, sometimes no employees valued at billions because they have a website and end in .com. American housing market. Banks selling mortgages to people who can't afford them, bundling those mortgages into products so complex nobody understands them, selling those products to investors around the world, until the whole thing collapses and takes the global economy with it. NFTs. People paying millions of dollars for a JPEG of a monkey. A digital image that anyone can right-click and save for free. Selling for more than a house. More than a car. More than most people earn in a lifetime. For a monkey JPEG. Different flowers. Same madness. Because here's what Tulip Mania actually taught us. Nothing. It taught us absolutely nothing. And that's not an insult. That's just the honest truth about human psychology. We are not rational creatures who occasionally make emotional decisions. We are emotional creatures who occasionally make rational ones. And when everyone around us is getting rich, when prices are climbing, when the story sounds convincing enough, the rational part switches off. Every single time. The tulip doesn't have to be a tulip. It just has to be something that enough people agree is valuable. And once that agreement reaches critical mass, it becomes self-fulfilling. Until it isn't. The merchant who traded his house for tulip bulbs in 1636 wasn't an idiot. He was a man living inside a story that everyone around him believed. The story made sense within its own logic. By now, prices always rise. Don't miss out. Everyone else is doing it. The story always makes sense from the inside. That's what makes it a bubble. Not the asset. Not the price. The story. And the most dangerous moment in any bubble isn't the crash. It's the moment just before it. When the story is so convincing, so universal, so backed by recent evidence, that questioning it feels not just wrong but embarrassing. When the person who says, "Wait, does this actually make sense?" gets laughed out of the tavern. That's the moment. That's always the moment. The tulips bloomed again in spring 1637. Red and purple and scarlet, exactly as beautiful as the year before. Same flowers. Same color. Same fragrance. Worth almost nothing. The only thing that had changed was the story. And stories, it turns out, are the most valuable and most fragile things in the entire economy. More than gold. More than oil. More than any flower ever grown. Build the right story and people will trade their houses for dirt and call it a bargain. Let the story crack and no price in the world can hold the line. The Dutch learned this in February 1637. We have been relearning it ever since.